Alright, so some key things to pay attention to when you guys put together your response is, like I said, 12-point font. Your third person, that's the difference between this one and yours, is that this will be third person. The sample I'm using is first person. Those are the main things to pay attention to, and then obviously indenting and double spacing, some basic things. Remember, you're writing about communities within your topic. Alright, let's go ahead and look at the introduction. A couple of things to pay attention to the introduction. There are good things and there are bad things that are happening. Let's look at the good things first. Alright, a couple of things. If you notice in the first couple of paragraphs, he mentions what discourse and communication are, or more or less communication and how those are important to communities. Now, it's very important because that sets up the paper and what the paper is about. He also introduces that he will be discussing 4 communities in the last sentence. Now, a couple of areas where this paper lacks is the fact that there is not a lot of details within the introduction. More details need to be said. Now let's go back to the second sentence where it says each community has a different way of describing and deciphering languages and codes in order to build a strong relationship. If we're looking at that, basically, he's giving us a broad interpretation. What he needs to do is break that down and give us something more specific. Okay, he needs to tell us what ways of describing and deciphering languages are used. Now he can use 2 of his own communities to compare that so we can see that in a more real life manner. That would greatly help that. And instead of posing this question about what constitutes a community, you should just go right into that and tell us what that is. Another area where this paper needs a little help is when he discusses gathering. Now he says it twice. Now that's repetition. That's something you would like to stay away from writing. That's just a basic concept and tool. Another thing is he does tell us he's going to discuss 4 communities, but what needs to happen is he needs to tell us what those 4 communities are and why those 4 communities are important for himself. Now the only difference you're going to be doing is giving us the 4 communities to your topic and why those are important to your topic. Now that's a key difference that you need to pay attention to. Alright, so looking at this first community, we see a couple of things that are happening. He's doing a lot of good things, but he's also doing some things where he needs to add some more information. I'm going to break that down. Okay, so first thing we can look at is we know who the first community is, which is Casas por Cristo. We know that the way they communicate with each other is through genres. Okay, that's important. And we also know who the members are. These are all important things, but what's lacking is the detail. We don't know enough about them, so more needs to be expanded. Okay, the one area I would say where there's a good enough information is when he's talking about the members. We know there's over 150 pastors, there's 15 members within the U.S., and there's so many volunteers within the U.S. as well. That's good, so we know that, and we know when they work. They work on 3-day weekends or during the summer. Those are good things to know, but what we don't know is how communication is used necessarily. Now we know that genres are used to communicate, and we know that there's specialized language, but we don't know what that specialized language is or how the genres are used. Okay, we know that emails, phone calls, and signed releases are used, but what needs to be said is how the emails are used to communicate, when phone calls are used, and what are signed releases used for. Okay, and who uses them? Is it just within the company? Is it companies and the people they're working for or helping out? Those are things that need to be said. Okay. And then another thing that is looked at is once the team is formed altogether, body language. What is that body language? You need to know what that body language is. Is it a positive outlook? How is it used? And then obviously the specialized language, you got religious belief, constructional terminology, and then the use of Spanglish or Spanish and English. Okay, we need to know what this structural terminology is. Now 1 or 2 examples would be fine there just so we can understand it. And then why is religious belief used in this specialized language? That needs to be said, not implied. And obviously, why is Spanish or how is Spanish learned while working? We need to know that. We don't know that yet. Alright, so let's slow down and let's take a look at these first 2 areas of the paper. Let's take a look at introduction and the first community. Alright, a couple of things that he's doing that are good is he's introducing us to what he's going to discuss. What's lacking is he's not giving us a very specific idea. It's more of a broad general idea. Now what you need to do is be more specific. Now obviously the biggest difference, like I said, is you're going to be working with communities about your topic. So you're going to have to be even more descriptive, okay? But this also works in your favor. A lot of the times when you work with things that are close to you, you're going to imply, because you already know that discourse, you already know that community, so you feel a less need to explain. Now that you're going to be dealing with communities that deal with your topic, you're going to want to research them, you're going to want to see how they work, and you're going to discuss that more thoroughly, I imagine, within your response. Okay, so for example, if you're going to be talking about a genre of a certain group, Well, you need to explain what those genres are and how those genres are used. For example, let's say I'm looking at the Humane Society and they use advertisements as a genre. You need to tell me what those advertisements are used for and who they're aimed at. Okay, for example, if I'm using an advertisement, it's aimed towards an audience and it's probably used towards animal lovers. Now, why is it used? Well, to help lure them in and help with what's taking place, the cause that's taking place, excuse me. A couple of other things that's happening within this paper is a lot of repetition and use of language. Repetition is something you'd like to stay away from as a writer. Um, if you stay away from repetition and use other words, it shows you're a more skillful writer. So that's something you need to practice. You're not going to get it on your first go, but that's something you'll get as you practice. And then another thing is using words and language, vocabulary. You need to know the vocabulary that you're using. Don't think that you have to use big words. You can use small words. It's the way you put it together. He's using words that he may not know necessarily, so you need to stay away from that. Okay, we're going to move on to some more communities and we're kind of point out other things within that as well. All right, so we're going to focus on genres again. This is something I think is important because it's something you're going to deal with through the entire semester. All right, so if we look at this section, he's talking about genres and how they're used. He talks about text messages, phone calls, emails, and flyers and advertisement, right? Now, what's lacking, again, is detail. He tells us the genres are used to communicate through coaches, players, and their families, but what's not being said is how they're used to communicate with players and families and how that's different between players and one another and how that's different between players and coaches or parents and coaches. That's not being said. Examples, real life examples would be perfect here. So you could say something, for example, phone calls are used between parents and coaches when a player is hurt. Something as simple as that gives me a lot of information and tells me what I need to know. Or, for example, flyers are used to communicate to the general public that a game is being played. This helps to represent advertisement for the team, but also support for the team. Something as simple as that. I mean, these are things that need to be known. Now, one thing that he does that's well is text messages and phone calls are most effective since they allow for quick information. That's really good. What needs to be followed up is an example. Okay, for example, when discussing something as a fundraiser, coaches will call parents. It's a brief 30-second conversation to let them know where the fundraiser is, what the fundraiser is about, etc., etc. So that's something that's missing. Okay, so again, detail, detail, detail. You're gonna hate me for that, but detail is very important in this class. All right, so let's take a look at these last two communities. Um, that's fine if you want to compare as he's doing here in this paper. It's perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with that. Just make sure that if you do it, you outline it and you're very detailed in making those similarities and differences. A couple of things that he's doing that's really well here is he introduces what he plans to do with these two communities, which is compare them and show that there are differences within them. That's really good. He sets that off the bat, and then he tells us what those two communities are, which is the family and the Lambda Chi, or Lambda Chi Alpha, excuse me, here at UTEP. So that's good. Now, one thing that he can do better is the way he introduces, like, you see where I have it outlined in red where he says, I will start with the comparison of the two. Simply just say, in comparison of the two, it is found that both the fraternity and family have similar rules and regulations in order to be a member or a significant part of the community. Okay, that's perfect for starting off, and then you tell us what those rules and regulations are. What happens here is he doesn't really outline what those rules and regulations are. He kind of goes into being respectful and participating in events outside the walls of your room within these two communities. Now, that's not really telling us rules or regulations. He's kind of going off track. You want to make sure if you introduce something, you stay on that track. So if he's going to introduce rules and regulations, we need to know what those rules are and how they're similar between the fraternity and his family. Okay, and he kind of discusses that when he's talking about being a gentleman and courteous and chivalrous, okay, and then maintaining language that's appropriate for women and children's hair. Now, the fact that he's telling us that, he needs to still show us an example. Now, obviously, the language that's appropriate for a fraternity isn't necessarily going to be the same for a family. Or he needs to outline how a fraternity can be appropriate in certain areas or venues, whereas they can be a little less within their own personal community. So that needs to be outlined and explained. Okay, so even though there are similarities in being appropriate and chivalrous and courteous, there are still differences in the way it's interpreted between a family and a fraternity. That's not being said. That needs to be said. Okay, another theme where he discusses, if you look downward, it says the most often used genre in communities that I am a part of is text messaging, and it is in direct conversation mixed with body language. You can see where I have it highlighted. It isn't direct conversation mixed with body language. I'm not sure what he means by that. That needs to be explained. But again, the genre you're talking about is text messaging. You need to outline, yes, there's similarities in that he text messages within both communities the most, but I'm sure there's differences, and that needs to be explained what those two differences are in the way he communicates with his family and how he communicates differently with his fraternity or his frat brothers. Now, that being said, within the family, texting is going to be different. The way you text your mother is going to be different than the way you may text your brother. That needs to be outlined as well. So, in short, if you're going to make comparisons, you need to outline what those comparisons. All right, so the conclusion. This is single-handedly the most important part of the paper. Reason being because this is the last thing that will be lingering in a reader's mind. Now, a couple of key things to keep in mind with the conclusion. A lot of times when you get to the conclusion, you're already at the point where you just don't want to write anymore and you don't care, so you get sloppy and you get lazy. You can't do that here. You need to be strong and know what you're saying within the conclusion. Don't be broad in general. Be very specific. Okay, don't just regurgitate what was in the introduction. Redefine it. Okay, so there's a difference there between regurgitating and redefining it. Okay, redefining is you're giving us more information. You give us something else to see further beyond what you already introduced us to. Okay, you're kind of answering things that were posed in the introduction. Okay, a couple of things to pay attention to that are different between this conclusion and your conclusion is obviously yours is going to revolve around your topic and your community topics, or sorry, your discourse communities. All right, your discourse communities, what you need to introduce or conclude with is this idea that how these communities are important not only to the topic at hand, but how they leave an impact on society. Okay, now those impacts can be negative or positive, kind of what's introduced here. Okay, and obviously you want to give real life examples. So if you're going to compare two communities that you're discussing, you want to tell us, like, for example, these communities can impact society in this manner, and then give us an example of how that's seen or how that's done. That's going to leave us with a greater impression than just giving us a broad general interpretation. Okay, and then obviously the last thing you want to do is reintroduce your thesis, which is this idea that what these four communities are and how they are important to the topic at hand. Okay, what importance do they have? What are they each doing differently? And how do they connect with each other even if they're doing it differently? Obviously they're connected to the topic, but you can reach deeper than that. So that's something you want to do with the conclusion. Okay, so 3 things you're doing is in the conclusion is involving detail, reintroducing your thesis, introducing how these communities are important to society, and then obviously the topic at hand. So those are key things you want to pay attention to when you put this conclusion together. It's a big difference than what you're seeing in this conclusion. But even one thing you can take away from this conclusion is the lack of detail that's used. Okay, if you look at it, you have a general idea of what they're discussing, but you don't have a very specific or good idea of how he's concluding. So that's something that you want to pay attention to when you put yours together. Again, these are important things to pay attention to. I hope this video helped you understand more or less what I'm looking for in the response. I mean, the biggest thing you can see that I'm looking at is detail, repetition, how you use vocabulary, and then how you describe your communities that you're discussing. And then obviously maintaining third person. If you look at this paper, he's mixing third, first, and second person together. You don't want to do that. You want to stay consistent. And then obviously you want to make sure that the writing is in present tense. It should not be in past tense or future tense. It should remain in present tense. That's it. I hope this is helpful, and you can always refer back to this. You can refer back to this over the week or whatever, but this should help you. All right. Good luck.